right now we're seeing Trump really undermine the US dollar and the US as the sort of reserve currency. What do you take away from that?
His administration and he seem to have many different views about what they want to happen. He has advisors who have quite complicated views. Mar-a-Lago Accord was floated by one of them, Stephen Miran, in a paper, who's now his head of his Council of Economic Advisors, in a paper he wrote before he became got that job, but very widely known. That was a plan to devalue the dollar.
This is The Global Gambit.
The world is in a state of flux. It is unprecedented, unparalleled. I think we can find all sorts of superlatives to describe that. But indeed, macroeconomics is something that we all have to pay attention to, even if we don't want to, because it affects us all in some way. And in this episode, we're going to be talking just about that: the relationship to geopolitical uncertainties, the role of the US hegemon, macroeconomics, currencies, lots to come up. So stay tuned. Today, my guest is Martin Wolf, Chief Economist at the Financial Times. Martin, absolute
Let me
pleasure.
just correct you slightly.
Oh.
Must get the title right. It's Chief Economics Commentator.
Commentator.
Because I have to distinguish myself
you're
from
not purely
the economics editor, who is also very important, who does all the reporting.
Or maybe we'll have him on. Maybe we can get you guys debating at some point. But thank you for that correction. We are, as you can see, everybody, coming from Martin's office. This is hilarious. Here in the heart of London. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this, Martin. Simply straight off, big question. 2.5, 3 weeks ago, we had Iran versus Israel. Now, that's a geopolitical issue. However, one of the things that a lot of people were curious about was, why weren't the markets more reactive? It seems to be that there's almost little to no care about what happens in the Middle East. And more generally, are we seeing a greater sort of resilience among markets when it comes to geopolitical clashes?
Well, I have two observations on this. One, I'm absolutely convinced that I don't know why markets behave in the way they do, and I strongly suspect nobody else does either. But in this case, I think they were right. The problem was this: there was a very low probability, not zero, that it would end up as a very significant economic event.
Right.
But how do you price markets when there's a 98% chance of nothing and a 2% chance of something serious which you don't know about? Very often markets behave, I think, quite rationally, as if nothing's going to happen. Because if it's a 2% probability, it really has to be big to make a difference to the outcome. So the sensible thing to do is to ignore it, which I think is more or less what happens. What would have made a big difference? Well, something I wrote about actually first in a column after the Gaza war started, after Hamas's attack on southern Israel. And basically I said, as long as it doesn't affect oil production and transport of oil and oil products from the Persian Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz, it doesn't matter economically. Right. It's from a human point of view, it's important, but it doesn't matter economically. And for it to affect oil production or transport through the Gulf, in this case, Iran would have had to make the decision to attack the Gulf's oil production facilities, which it clearly could have done with missiles, and or, again, which it could have done to stop tankers going through. But that would have been a declaration of war. I mean, sort of World War type strategy. And I thought, as it turned out completely correctly, the Iranians were far too sensible to do something like that. And as long as none of that happened, it's not a macroeconomic event. It's just a political event.
Okay, Martin, so that makes sense. But I mean, personally, I've never thought the Iranians not to be rational actors. They're very good at, I think, pushing the limits when it comes to escalation management.
Yeah.
But one of the things that oil seemed to do was spike a little bit. It went up, 5-6 percentage points, and then came down. Yeah, I mean, some people think it's a lot. I personally, what we saw, 10 years ago with the Arab Spring, and also during, obviously, the early days of the Iraq and Afghan war, respectively. So do you think that we're just generally seeing more commodities or components of the markets just generally sort of absorb what happens in the Middle East alone, or it's just global?
Well, there's another factor which I didn't discuss. The first factor is, does it affect oil prices significantly? I mean, about a third of oil is produced in about a third of the world's reserves. More than that, actually, of world's reserves are in the Middle East. My memory is something like a fifth of all world oil products goes through the Gulf of the Straits of Hormuz. So if it was stopped, the effect on oil prices would be radical. There's no doubt. That would probably, I don't know exactly, but at least double oil prices.
Right.
Remember, in the 1970s, when we really knew what an oil shock was, oil prices in the first round quadrupled. And the second time, if I remember correctly, in the second oil shock, they doubled.
Yes.
Now, and that's a really big shock. So if oil prices had gone, let's say now, because of a huge shock to $200 a barrel, we'd be seeing a significant effect. But the second moderating factor, first is obviously none of that happened. It wasn't a shock like that for reasons we've discussed. But the second moderating factor is we're much less oil dependent than we were. So if you relate the use of oil to global GDP, or the GDP of the advanced countries, is more than halved since the 70s. We've got a far more diversified set of energy inputs, far less dependent on oil. We use lots more gas, we use solar and wind. We're talking worldwide. So the impact on the economy of a shutdown in oil and a huge spike in oil prices is just not going to be as big as it was in the 70s, because we've got a much more diversified energy mix. For both these reasons: one, nothing really happened to the oil price, and second, that it's less important. We're not going to have the sorts of crises we had in the 70s, which were the extreme point in the sensitivity of the world economy to oil shocks. And they were very big. I worked through them. I know exactly what it was like.
I can imagine. Well, I can't actually, I wasn't around. But when it comes to then, specifically, because China's done a remarkable job of decoupling in some ways in energy formats. Its renewable energy industry is incredible. Solar panels.
Yes.
The
And they also still produce a lot of coal.
Yes, they do. But do you think that, relative speaking, in that context specifically, if we end on the sort of Iran pivot for a moment, there was quite an interesting point that I heard being discussed, that the Americans were badgering the Chinese to get Iran not to do anything with the Strait of Hormuz. Is that because the Americans are still more dependent on oil versus the Chinese, or you think
the Americans are completely independent?
So why do they care so much?
They care because it would affect significantly the world economy, and America is not actually decoupled from the world economy. Europe is very dependent on the Gulf. Really very dependent on the Gulf in terms of oil imports. Again, its energy mix is diversified, like China's, not as far, but still very substantially. But and the health of the European economy does affect the United States. But the United States actually has become effectively energy self-sufficient. So for its own economy, ignoring the indirect ramification for the rest of the world economy on the US, which is real, though not colossal, the US is really in a remarkably secure position.
When it comes to the United States, then, one of the things that is obviously, we can talk about energy, but I also want to talk about the trade element. You've had quite a lot to say on Trump's trade policy, or well, their lack of, and right as we're speaking, obviously, he is beginning to reintroduce tariffs. Especially, the case study I would focus on is the Japanese. They have been head down super hard trying to find a way through to, well, essentially appease him, but also because they're a very loyal ally of the US. So what do you make of the first, should we say, 6 months of Trump's trade policy, and just generally his approach to trying to use economic warfare like that?
This is really a difficult thing to discuss in a short period. Well, first of all, which is quite important, he really doesn't understand the underlying economics. And that's true on many absolutely fundamental levels. So what he's trying to do doesn't make sense. It's part of the problem. He thinks that trade policy determines the trade deficit. Mm-hmm.
No, it doesn't.
And it doesn't. And I mean, this is something that economists worked through rigorously in the middle of the 20th century. And basically, I won't go into all the details because it would take a while, but essentially, the trade deficit is a macroeconomic phenomenon, or more precisely, to be technical, the current account deficit. Current account is a little bit different from the trade deficit because it includes factor services. And of course, it includes service trade. While most of the time when Trump is talking about trade deficit, he's talking about manufactures,
Right.
which is only a part of the trade deficit. The US actually has a huge surplus in services. But anyway, the current account deficit is the difference between income and expenditure in a society. That's a macroeconomic phenomenon. The composition depends on comparative advantage and trade policy, what you import, what you export, and in what quantity. But the difference between the two, which is the current account deficit, reflects income and expenditure. And the point is that the US runs an enormous fiscal deficit. So the government runs a huge excess of spending over revenue. The other major sectors in the US economy, households and corporates, are close to balance. They have a very small surplus of savings over investment. So in aggregate, the US has an enormous excess demand. And that has to be matched by a current account deficit. So as long as the fiscal deficit remains as big as it is, they're going to go on running a current account deficit. And since they have had just agreed on a hugely expansionary budget, we know this is going to go on. So the trade policy is irrelevant to the aim that he wants to do, which is to get rid of the deficit. He thinks, however, that the trade deficit is determined by trade policy. And if he forces other countries to liberalize and buy more US goods, particularly US goods, then the trade deficit, bilateral trade deficit, it will disappear with every country. And then the whole aggregate will disappear. None of that actually is economically true. Because if you cut one set of bilateral deficits, others will expand because, as I said, income and expenditure won't be affected. To a first approximation.
Okay.
Well, more than just the first approximation. And then, as I said and already implied, instead of looking at if he had been right, he would have raised tariffs on all imports uniformly. Instead, he's treating it as a whole set of bilateral negotiations. And because there is going to be higher bilateral tariffs bilaterally on some importers than on other importers, there's just going to be trade diversion. That is, people will shift their purchases from the countries that are relatively high tariffs imposed to countries with lower tariffs. None of that is in Trump's mind. He just doesn't understand any of it. And neither do, so far as I can see, do his advisors. So the whole thing is fruitless in terms of his objectives, which is bad enough. Now, but what he has done, and this is where we are now, he's obviously created a vast amount of uncertainty. He introduced these extraordinary tariffs, which initially, the Liberation Day, April the 2nd, these extraordinary tariffs, which were different for every country pretty well, the lowest being 10%. And then he said, now I'm going to negotiate bilaterally with all of you to a deal, a country by country deal, completely unheard of in the history of trade policy and completely nuts. And then, and this is completely predictable, within the 90 days, it was impossible to reach these deals except outline skeleton deals with 3 countries, 2 of which happened to be the UK and China for various reasons. But trade deals normally take years to reach. And these are big deals, deals that cover the sort of the world. So doing deals with, let's say, 180 countries, let's leave out 100 or so countries within 3 months, which would be hard and fast and meaningful, was completely impossible from a diplomatic point of view. That's quite apart from the economics. And in the end, they've ended up with skeleton deals with 3 countries. Now he's running out of time and he wants to reach deals, as I understand it, with about 100 countries. And that's not going to happen. It's just impossible to do this. And that what makes it even more difficult, and this is what the Japanese are saying, and others, we don't know what these people want. Because of when they started of this, all this. They didn't have a policy that had been worked out based on any understanding at all of what each country in the world could offer, would offer, how the different deals would interlock with one another. It was all complete nonsense. So now they are going to start threatening new tariffs. They postponed them for a few more weeks, but none of this is going to work. So at some point, they're going to have to postpone it indefinitely, or they're going to have to impose some tariffs, which are crazy, and we'll start the next round of the trade war, and with its economic consequences. So the policy is crazy. It won't work technically or diplomatically, but what it does do is create vast uncertainty. And that, of course, will affect trade and investment across the world and in the US, because nobody will know in these sectors that are affected what the trade policy is going to be next week, let alone next year. And this comes back to my final point. If you look at the history of trade negotiations, going back, we've had trade negotiations for centuries. There were major trade negotiations in the 19th century, very famous treaty between Britain and France in 1860. So you reach a deal, it takes you years to reach the deal, and then it's forever. You stick because that's what allows people to plan. But that's not going to happen with Trump. So basically, this is nuts, wildly destabilizing, and very costly.
Well, that'll be the soundbite, I think, for the episode. This is nuts. No, I mean, I know. Look how long the European Union and Mercosur have been trying to establish something, right?
Well, think how long it took the EU to reach every one of its stages of development. Under the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade and the WTO, there were, I think, 8 big negotiating rounds. Each of them took years. Some of them were a bit quicker because they were immediately after the Second World War and they wanted some liberalization very quickly, but most of them took years. The Kennedy round took most of the 60s, the Tokyo round most of the 70s, the Uruguay round took, I think, 8 years. That's how long these things take, because they're very complicated and they affect every sector of the economy. And you want to know that you think this is a fair deal, both sides affected. It's just very, very complicated to do. I won't go into all the sectors that are affected by this, but the dimensions are absolutely stupendous, because trade affects everything in the economy.
No, for sure. That's why I think there's such a need to focus on it specifically. But one element of this that I do want to unpack a little bit more is the uncertainty, because Trump seems to think that if you're not going to play ball with him on his level, then he's going to punish you. He's going to use punitive measures, and including the weaponization of the dollar.
Yeah.
So I wanted to shift a little bit towards the currency aspect, because right now we're seeing Trump really undermine the US dollar and the US as the sort of reserve currency. So what do you take away from that? There's a lot of discussion about BRICS and this whole idea of an alternative world order. I'm not going to go too down those concepts because I think we can get into the weeds a bit. But specifically, do you think that Trump is really undermining the US's leadership in, forget military stuff, but economics and as the US as the reserve currency?
Again, very complicated, but I suppose the short answer is yes. But it's very complicated. His administration and he seem to have many different views about what they want to happen. He has advisors who have quite complicated views. Mar-a-Lago Accord was floated by one of them. Stephen Miran, in a paper, who's now his head of his Council of Economic Advisors, in a paper he wrote before he became got that job, but very widely known. And that was a plan to devalue the dollar and basically to default. But that's a more complicated issue. Scott Bessent, his Treasury Secretary, has views which are more conventional. But Trump's view seems to be that we must punish anybody who doesn't want to use the dollar. But he's perfectly happy to see the dollar depreciate because it makes American goods more competitive. And he's perfectly happy to threaten countries with all sorts of punishments if they don't do what he wants them to do, multiple different ways. And these are contradictory, obviously. Holding the US dollar is ultimately a matter of confidence in the US. You can't force someone to hold the currency. Most countries, well, actually all countries, do most of their trade with other people. The trade they do with the US is not overwhelming. It's not that colossal. So they don't have to hold dollars to trade with the US. They hold dollars because it's useful to use the American financial system. It's the most developed, and because the dollar has been seen as the safest currency in the world. US is a superpower. It's run in a responsible way. The financial markets are open. These are all the reasons you hold the dollar, and it's been the guarantor of global stability since the Second World War. Now, Trump comes along, he makes the trading system wildly unpredictable. He makes his alliances unpredictable too. And he pursues a fiscal policy that looks terrifying if you look at the debt implications. So all these things together will make people, and then there's been all the sanctions on holders of dollars, like Russia for that matter. So for all these reasons, people think we should diversify from the dollar. We shouldn't rely on it that much. We can't rely on this country. And maybe he's just going to default. He's closed the capital markets. We can't use the dollar in America anymore. In some way, that sort of punishment will occur. So we better diversify. The advantage the Americans have, and it's a deep structural advantage, is that there isn't a good alternative. So while I think they're clearly making the dollar a less reliable and attractive asset to hold, and indeed they're promoting themselves, some of the alternatives, cryptocurrencies and so forth, though I don't think they're real alternatives at all, but there isn't an obvious replacement. There are only really two plausible ones, the renminbi, and the problem with the yuan renminbi is it doesn't have open capital markets. So you can't use it as a financial store of value and means of payment in the way you can the dollar. And not irrelevantly, you could be worried that the Chinese, if they don't like you, will also act against you and freeze your holdings. I mean, why would that be surprising? So that's not, countries that need to trade with China bilaterally will be perfectly happy to hold its currency. The digital yuan could be perfectly attractive, but that's not making it a world currency.
What do you see being sort of the most likely short to medium term international order, quote unquote?
The idea that what we were creating was a borderless world was a complete illusion. And this is the biggest point I made in my book. Integration into the world economy was a policy choice, crucial. And then a lot of countries made this choice to integrate because they had come to the view this would help them become more prosperous.